Hello, Meoni here, and welcome back to another video for Final Fantasy XIV. We're looking at interviews today, specifically this one on Inverse. A link in the description of the video will be there for you to go and give that website some support. And thank you specifically to Hayes Madsen for doing this particular article, and of course the fantastic interview. I'm always excited to see interviews with our main man Yoshi P. So let's have a look at this. Obviously the title is The King of Final Fantasy Reveals Why the Series is, quote, struggling. That's a very interesting title. So Yoshi P says, for me, Final Fantasy is about having a deep story, rich game design, the best game audio to accompany those aspects, as well as the inclusion of chocobos, moogles, and summons. So that's kind of like the way you would expect Final Fantasy to be recognized. You know, the main tropes of the series, and then obviously, you know, to go all out on all of the main elements, because, you know, Final Fantasy is a story-rich experience. You know, the game design has to follow with that, and then obviously Masayoshi Soken is literally a genius, so yeah, that's not surprising. He says, I believe the essence of a job is getting paid to do what others find troublesome, Yoshida says. The more your job is something people don't like or don't want to do, the more praise and recognition you will receive for accomplishing it. Once you build up credibility, you can take on bigger challenges and will be permitted to spend greater sums of money. As such, my mentality remains unchanged even today, end quote. That is a very refreshing view to actually look at the games industry, especially considering a lot of people, as he says, you know, approach elements of game design and go, oof, that's the bit I don't like, or that's going to be hard, and they drag their heels a little bit, I would imagine. Yoshida knows that those are the least satisfying, you know, parts of the job. However, the satisfaction comes from making it a reality. So I guess he sees everything as a bit of a challenge, and that's a very refreshing attitude, one that I don't really see talked about that often. Normally it's, let's see how much crunch we can put on developers to make something happen, rather than methodically realizing that it's a challenge and working towards it. So very interesting. And of course, you know, the idea that if you do get it right, you get more money to invest into the product. That's Final Fantasy XIV in a nutshell. We've seen, obviously, in the Metacritic scores alone, even if you don't like them, have gone up to the 90s, all the way from what, the 30s originally, the 30 scores. So it's not surprising. They talk a little bit about Yoshi P's background, obviously with Dragon Quest, Monster Battle Road, and all that stuff there. And then Yoshi P says, I think the very concept of online gaming will gradually disappear. Though the scale of integration may vary, there's hardly any video games without some sort of online component these days. I think the distinction will be reduced to whether it's a multiplayer or single player. That's a good point as well. Yeah, there are online elements to everything. I mean, there was if you remember, a huge problem people had, including myself, with the always online experience. And as internet, you know, speeds have increased over the last decade, including where I am to be able to make these videos in the first place, as regularly as I do and stream, for example, it's become less of a problem. You know, solving the issue of internet speeds first on a global sort of scale, each of those countries, including my own, slowly it's got to the point where I care less and less about the always online components. The only time I think I've ever noticed what is actually online and what is offline is recently with the Steam Deck, when I've been trying to play my Steam library, and there's quite a few games that I didn't realize were always online, that always required an internet connection. There's very few that are offline available. So he's right, it will disappear, the concept of online gaming. Yoshi P says, after more than 10 years on a project, he says, I want to keep making sure that Final Fantasy XIV will be fondly remembered by many as a fun game that gave them the best gaming experience, he says. I also want to make sure that it will remain in operation for decades to come. Interesting, very interesting. Well, yeah, we kind of hope that's the case anyway. So decades to come, though. So more than 10 years, fingers crossed. Well, look at Final Fantasy XI, right? It's still chugging along and still getting updates. So yes. Yoshi P says, if we think in terms of the next decade, the development and spread of new devices such as VR chips may give the way to revolutionary game experiences. I'd thought this could happen a bit sooner, but I believe it might have been delayed by several years due to the shortage of semiconductors caused by the COVID-19 pandemic and other factors. When you think about technological implications of the pandemic, you don't really naturally think about future tech stuff and how that would have been affected. But yeah, it's very hard to test and to work on things for the future if you don't have the capability to do so. That's a good point I didn't think about. I only thought about the lateral, like the need now for like servers and things, not necessarily the future. So I think we'll be feeling like the impact of that for many years to come, right? I would imagine. Yoshi P says, this would dramatically increase server performance and elements that could be simulated. That could lead to the creation of a living world that resembles reality, or even new ideas that create an actual online world, he explains. There is the possibility that game development styles will drastically change and culminate in a major turning point, not only for video games, but everyday life itself. End quote. All I've got in my mind right now is Sword Art Online. Is Yoshi P going to be the innovator of the nerve gear technology to create the next MMO that's plugged directly into your brain? Is that where we're going with this? I would find it very difficult for other people not to get that as well. It's quite good. It's quite scary as well. This next segment then is talking about a healthy work-life balance for employees and how Japanese companies like Bandai Namco are trying to move towards that. And Yoshi P has an interesting statement on this. He says, as long as games remain a form of entertainment, I believe the only solution is to keep examining the issue and meticulously improve management methods. No matter how much someone wants to carry on with their work, in order to avoid burnout, it's important to assign mandatory breaks and have them re-energized before they reach their limit, end quote. It's interesting that Yoshi P would bring this up because in the past we've had moments where, if you remember with the Vieira hairstyles and hats, if I remember correctly, people were disgruntled with a lot of that. And if I remember, didn't a member of staff supposedly work on that after hours? It's very difficult to praise that kind of behavior, and I can imagine from, a management perspective, that's not something that you can really be too harsh on either, because at the end of the day, if a person is willing to do that out of hours, then it's partially on them, but from a management position, it makes them look bad because, it makes it look like they insinuated they would need to do that extra work. So yeah, I think a healthier experience in the workplace is probably going to be one of the side effects from people realizing that pandemics and things like that have already slowed things down. They've adjusted their patch cycle to give even more space between that. So hopefully that will mean less burnout for the developers and artists and animators and things like that and content designers, because it's not a pretty thing to see. We've all heard the nasty rumors and things about CD Projekt Red and other things on the internet. So it's interesting that they would bring this up, but hopefully they can find a good work-life balance and try to teach that to the people that work for them, because it makes the company ultimately look pretty bad. It makes them look like they're underhandedly telling them to do extra work when in reality they're not, right? Even if they enjoy what they do to the point where they want to do it out of hours. Yoshida certainly could use a break. I'm sure he would. 35-year legacy. The man is an absolute genius, though, to be perfectly honest. Yoshida says here about the entire Final Fantasy series, In terms of whether Final Fantasy is successfully adapting to industry trends, I believe the series is currently struggling. We're now at a point where we receive a wide variety of requests regarding the direction of our game design. To be honest, it'd be impossible to satisfy all those requests with a single title. My current impression is that all we can really do is create multiple games and continue creating the best that we can at any given time. End quote. So I suppose the series is really struggling because of the originality in places as well. Like, people have played Final Fantasy games before, but it comes down to much more than just the storytelling as well at the end of the day. And honestly, I think setting the bar high with things like Final Fantasy XIV, even though it is an MMORPG and isn't a single player experience, I still think there are things in 14 that make that a better single player game than a lot of their earlier titles. I think some people might agree with that. And that's from refinement, right? You learn these things from refinement. And that's something only an MMORPG would be able to do, right? Because people play it, they give feedback, and you can change it there and then, and you can update it in expansions. You can't really do that with a single player title, because once it's out, it's out. You can patch it, you can add DLC to it, but it's still got a shelf lifespan in comparison to, an ongoing live service sort of video game. It's going to be very tricky, especially considering Yoshida-san is so successful with what he and his team have done with Final Fantasy XIV. Final Fantasy XVI is probably going to be quite the challenge, I would imagine, to fit into everybody's idea of what that game would be. But I think they've got the perfect guy behind it, obviously. Yoshi P says, I am a game designer, so I always have several ideas for games. I can't talk about them here, but I think that goes for any game designer. I'm the kind of person who's happy as long as they can make games, so while there isn't anything in particular, I occasionally did think that I would like to make one more MMORPG title from scratch before I die, end quote. That is something to take in. That is the last part of this interview, and probably the most prominent part of it, I would say. That is quite surprising. So Yoshi P never stops, man. The guy is just, I don't know what he has for breakfast, but I would love some. He definitely had his ready break or his shredded wheat or whatever each day, or his cigarettes or whatever, because holy moly. Can you imagine the legacy of this man eventually? Wants to make another MMORPG? That would be fantastic. But who would you really trust with that other than Naoki Yoshida at Square Enix? I mean, I'm all for like new blood and like bringing in other people, but if he's capable of stirring the passions and emotions in the team to make Final Fantasy XIV what it is today, imagine what he could do with a next-gen title that's an MMORPG. I've got all kinds of things flowing through my mind. I cannot wait to see that reality. And hopefully we see that, right? And hopefully he does more than just that before, quote, and I die. I want him to live for many, many, many years, and to see him, maybe even do another Dragon Quest game or something. I have no idea. But very exciting times. But I don't think Final Fantasy XIV could be in a better place right now, especially in the series as well. It really has risen way above a lot of people's expectations. Even if you were the most passionate fan, I don't think anybody could have predicted where it is currently at this exact moment in time. So, very exciting stuff, very interesting stuff, and some good insights there. Thank you very much to Hayes Madsen. Hopefully I've not butchered your name. A link in the description of the video will take you to this article. Very interesting stuff. Go give it some viewership. I don't know how websites work, but I think they're based on clicks, right? So go give that some love. But yeah, very interesting stuff, especially about him basically becoming the creator of Sword Art Online. Maybe that's what we might see in the future. Final Fantasy integrated AR or something. Exciting future. Just plug me in already. I'm done with life. All right. Enjoy your day, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.